When we think of the early 20th century and the grand age of ocean liners, one name immediately dominates the conversation, echoing through history with a chilling finality: the Titanic. It is a story ingrained in our collective consciousness, told and retold through blockbuster films, countless documentaries, and endless historical debates. But the Titanic was not an only child. She was merely the middle sibling in a trio of magnificent vessels conceived by the White Star Line to conquer the transatlantic crossing. Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on the third and final ship of that legendary Olympic class, a ship that was destined to be the largest, the safest, and the most luxurious of them all, yet ended up relegated to a mere footnote in the shadow of her infamous sister. This is the story of the HMHS Britannic. It truly is fascinating how the overwhelming cultural footprint of the Titanic has completely eclipsed the Britannic. If you walk down the street and ask anyone about the Titanic, they can probably tell you about the iceberg, the lack of lifeboats, and the band playing on the deck. But if you ask them about the Britannic, you are likely to be met with blank stares. Yet the story of the Britannic is just as dramatic, just as fraught with catastrophic irony, and in many ways infinitely more complex, because it intersects directly with the greatest global conflict the world had seen up to that point, the First World War. We are talking about a vessel that was specifically redesigned from the keel up to survive the exact scenario that doomed the Titanic, only to find herself facing a completely different, entirely more violent kind of peril. Exactly. We are diving deep into a tale of unparalleled engineering hubris, the chaotic theater of naval warfare, and a tragedy that unfolded in the sparkling waters of the Aegean Sea. We will explore how the heartbreaking lessons learned from the freezing waters of the North Atlantic were painstakingly applied to the Britannic, transforming her into an armored leviathan that was supposed to be practically unsinkable, for real this time. We will track her unexpected conversion from a floating palace of Edwardian luxury into a massive, pristine white hospital ship dedicated to saving the lives of wounded soldiers. And of course, we will meticulously unpack the shocking, rapid timeline of her sinking, examining the fiercely debated theories surrounding her demise. Was it a German torpedo, an indiscriminate naval mine, or perhaps something even more insidious, like a secondary internal explosion caused by illicit cargo? To understand the Britannic, we really have to look at the genesis of the Olympic-class liners as a whole. This was not just about building ships. It was about staking a claim on the future of international travel. It was about national pride, corporate dominance, and pushing the absolute boundaries of what human engineering could achieve at the dawn of the 20th century. The White Star Line was locked in a fierce, uncompromising rivalry with the Cunard Line. Cunard had recently launched the Lusitania and the Mauretania, two incredibly fast, sleek greyhounds of the sea that had completely captured the public imagination. White Star knew they could not easily compete on sheer speed, so they made a calculated, highly ambitious pivot. They decided to compete on size, unparalleled luxury, and an overwhelming sense of grandeur. And that grand vision was famously sketched out during a fateful dinner party in the summer of 1907 at the London mansion of Lord Peary, the chairman of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, attended by J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. Over brandy and cigars, they conceived of three mammoth vessels that would dwarf anything else afloat. They would be the Olympic, the Titanic, and a third ship, originally rumored to be named the Gigantic. This trio was meant to provide a weekly express service across the Atlantic, offering a level of comfort that would make passengers forget they were even at sea. Construction began in Belfast at Harland and Wolff, requiring the construction of massive new gantries just to accommodate the sheer scale of the hulls. The Olympic launched first in 1910 and enjoyed a relatively long, successful career, earning the nickname Old Reliable. The Titanic launched next, and we all know exactly how tragically brief her career was in April of 1912. The sinking of the Titanic completely shattered the White Star Line's narrative of invincibility. It was a profound, traumatizing shock to the entire maritime world. At the exact moment the Titanic was slipping beneath the waves of the North Atlantic, taking over 1,500 souls with her, the hull of the third sister ship was sitting on the slipway in Belfast, only partially framed. All work on this third ship was immediately and abruptly halted. The White Star Line and the naval architects at Harland and Wolff realized they could not simply proceed as planned. The public trust was broken. The safety regulations of the Board of Trade were being completely rewritten overnight. The third ship could not just be another Titanic. It had to be a fortress. It had to be the definitive answer to every single fatal flaw that the ice had exposed in her sister. That is exactly right. The redesign of this third ship was exhaustive and incredibly expensive. First, they tackled the name. While the White Star Line later officially denied that they ever intended to name her Gigantic, the historical consensus heavily leans toward the fact that they did, and wisely decided to change it to something a little less arrogant and a little more patriotic in the wake of the disaster. They named her Britannic. But the changes went far beyond a fresh coat of paint and a new name on the bow. They fundamentally altered the ship's architecture. The most significant structural change was the implementation of a double skin along the engine and boiler rooms. They literally built a second inner hull, creating an incredibly strong 2-foot-wide protective buffer designed to withstand the exact kind of prolonged scraping impact that had popped rivets and opened the seams of the Titanic. And they did not stop there. The watertight compartments, which had famously failed on the Titanic because the bulkheads did not reach high enough, allowing water to spill over the tops from one compartment to the next like a flooding ice cube tray, were completely redesigned. On the Britannic, 6 of the 15 watertight bulkheads were raised all the way up to B deck. This meant that the Britannic could theoretically survive with her first 6 compartments entirely flooded, whereas the Titanic was only designed to survive with 4. Furthermore, they addressed the catastrophic shortage of lifeboats that had doomed so many on the Titanic. The Britannic was outfitted with massive, prominent gantry davits. These towering crane-like structures were capable of launching up to 6 lifeboats each, and crucially, they were designed to be able to reach across the deck. This meant that even if the ship developed a severe list to one side, preventing the lifeboats on the high side from being lowered down the hull, these massive davits could pick them up and swing them all the way over to the low side for launching. It was a marvel of responsive engineering. They even increased the engine power, making her slightly larger and heavier than the Titanic, solidifying her status as the largest ship in the world at that time. By February of 1914, the Britannic was finally launched into the Victoria Channel in Belfast to immense fanfare. The White Star Line heavily marketed her as the pinnacle of maritime safety and luxury. The interiors were slated to be even more opulent than the Titanic, featuring additional private bathrooms, a magnificent pipe organ in the first-class grand staircase, and a beautifully appointed playroom for children. She was scheduled to begin her maiden voyage between Southampton and New York in the spring of 1915. But destiny, it seemed, had a completely different and far darker plan for the Olympic-class liners.
Indeed. Before the Britannic could even be fully fitted out with all those luxurious amenities, the geopolitical landscape of Europe completely fractured. In August 1914, the First World War erupted. Suddenly, the transatlantic passenger trade completely collapsed. The wealthy elite were no longer booking leisurely voyages across the ocean. Shipyards were immediately pivoted to military production. The White Star Line made the strategic decision to lay up the unfinished Britannic in Belfast, hoping the conflict would be a brief affair and they could resume normal operations shortly. But as the war dragged on and expanded into a brutal, grinding conflict on multiple fronts, the British government realized they needed massive logistical support. In November of 1915, the British Admiralty formally requisitioned the Britannic. She was not going to be a troop ship, however. The Gallipoli campaign in the Mediterranean had resulted in horrific casualties, and the medical infrastructure was completely overwhelmed. The military desperately needed floating hospitals capable of transporting thousands of wounded soldiers back to Britain. So, the luxurious ocean liner was rapidly transformed into His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic. The transformation was striking. Her massive black hull was painted brilliantly white, adorned with a thick, vibrant green stripe running from bow to stern, interrupted by 3 massive red crosses painted on her sides. Furthermore, giant illuminated red crosses were rigged on her boat deck, so she could be clearly identified as a hospital ship at night, theoretically granting her protection from enemy attack under the strict rules of the Geneva Convention. The internal conversion was equally drastic. The opulent first-class dining saloons and the grand reception rooms were completely stripped of their luxurious furnishings and repurposed into massive surgical operating theaters and intensive care wards. The sprawling promenades where wealthy socialites were supposed to stroll in their finery were lined shoulder to shoulder with military cots. The ship was outfitted to carry 3,309 patients, alongside a dedicated medical staff of nearly 500 doctors, nurses, and orderlies, plus the ship's operational crew.
The Britannic was placed under the command of Captain Charles Bartlett, a highly respected and deeply experienced mariner who was well known for his strict discipline and his profound concern for the safety of his crew and passengers. It is here that we must introduce one of the most remarkable and frankly unbelievable figures in maritime history, a woman named Violet Jessop. Violet was a stewardess for the White Star Line and a volunteer nurse. Her life story is so wildly improbable that if you wrote it in a fiction novel, no one would believe you. In 1911, Violet was working aboard the RMS Olympic when it famously collided with the British warship HMS Hawke. She survived that harrowing incident unharmed. A year later, in 1912, she was transferred to work aboard the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. When the Titanic struck the iceberg and sank, Violet was ordered into Lifeboat 16, where she spent the freezing night holding a stranger's baby until they were rescued by the Carpathia. And now, in 1916, defying all odds and perhaps common sense, Violet Jessop was serving as a nurse aboard the HMHS Britannic. Violet Jessop's presence on all three of the Olympic-class liners during their most defining and disastrous moments makes her a legendary figure. She provides a deeply personal, remarkably vivid through line connecting these three massive vessels. In her memoirs, she described the atmosphere aboard the Britannic during those wartime voyages. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious environment she was accustomed to. Instead of serving champagne and arranging flowers, she was tending to terribly wounded, traumatized young men returning from the brutal fronts of the Mediterranean theater. The work was absolutely exhausting, deeply emotional, and fraught with the constant underlying tension of navigating through a heavily contested war zone. The Mediterranean was swarming with German U-boats, and despite the bright white paint and the giant red crosses, every single voyage felt like a massive roll of the dice.
The Britannic successfully completed 5 arduous voyages to the Middle Eastern theater, bringing thousands of wounded soldiers safely home to the United Kingdom. She performed her duties flawlessly, proving that her robust design and massive scale made her an exceptionally stable and capable hospital ship. In November of 1916, she departed Southampton for her 6th voyage. She was headed back to the Greek port of Mudros on the island of Lemnos to pick up another massive load of casualties. The ship was not fully loaded with patients yet. On this outward leg, she was carrying mostly her crew and the medical staff, totaling roughly 1,066 people on board. They passed smoothly through the Strait of Gibraltar and made a scheduled coaling stop in Naples, Italy, before proceeding into the treacherous waters of the Aegean Sea. Let us set the scene precisely. It is the morning of Tuesday, November 21st, 1916. The Britannic is steaming through the Chia Channel, a narrow body of water situated between the Greek mainland and the island of Chia. It is a stunningly beautiful morning. The sun is shining brightly, the sky is perfectly clear, and the waters of the Aegean Sea are completely calm, almost resembling a sheet of glass. It is roughly 8 o'clock in the morning. Many of the medical staff are just finishing their breakfast in the dining saloon. Others are relaxing on the decks, enjoying the warm Mediterranean breeze. Down in the massive engine rooms, the black gang of stokers and firemen are shoveling coal into the roaring furnaces, keeping the enormous vessel moving at a brisk speed of 20 knots. And then, at exactly 8:12 a.m., the idyllic morning is violently shattered. A massive, deafening explosion rips through the starboard side of the Britannic, right near the bow. The force of the blast is absolutely tremendous. It shakes the massive 48,000-ton vessel to her very core. Down in the forward boiler rooms, the reality of the situation is immediate and catastrophic. A massive hole has been blown completely through the ship's double skin. The ocean is instantly rushing in with terrifying force. Firemen and stokers are suddenly fighting for their lives in a chaotic, deafening torrent of freezing seawater and blinding steam. On the upper decks, the reaction is initially a mix of confusion and alarm. The ship shudders violently, a massive vibration echoing all the way back to the stern. And then a strange, ominous silence falls over the vessel as the initial shockwave dissipates. Up on the bridge, Captain Charles Bartlett immediately leaps into action. He instantly orders the closing of the watertight doors. He immediately rings the engine room telegraph to stop the engines. He sends out a distress signal, a frantic SOS echoing across the wireless frequencies. Bartlett is a seasoned commander, and he knows exactly what needs to be done. He is fully aware of the ship's exceptional safety features. He knows about the double skin. He knows about the raised bulkheads. He initially believes that the Britannic is more than capable of surviving this damage. But a horrifying cascade of completely unforeseen complications is about to seal the fate of the mighty ship.
First and foremost, the explosion occurred in the absolute worst possible location. It detonated right at the bulkhead dividing hole number 1 and the forepeak, effectively destroying the watertight integrity of the first 2 compartments instantly. But far more devastating was the damage to the fireman's tunnel, which ran through the boiler rooms. The blast severely distorted the massive steel bulkhead between boiler rooms 5 and 6. Because of this massive structural distortion, the heavy watertight doors in that critical area failed to close properly. They were jammed open, allowing the ocean to surge uncontrollably past the very barriers designed to stop it. Within minutes, the first 6 massive watertight compartments of the Britannic were rapidly flooding. Remember, the ship was designed to survive with 6 compartments completely flooded, so she was right on the absolute bleeding edge of her survivability limit.
And this is where a completely mundane, routine human action turned a critical situation into an absolutely fatal one. It was a beautiful, clear morning in the Mediterranean. As was customary, the nurses and orderlies had opened the lower deck portholes along the forward wards to air them out and let in the fresh sea breeze before they arrived at port to pick up patients. This was a direct violation of standing wartime orders, which strictly mandated that lower portholes must remain closed while the ship was underway to maintain watertight integrity. But in the daily routine of shipboard life, the rule had been casually ignored for the sake of fresh air. As the Britannic's bow began to settle heavily into the water due to the massive flooding in the first 6 compartments, those open portholes on the lower decks were suddenly pulled completely underwater. It was a fatal blow. The open portholes essentially bypassed the ship's entire sophisticated watertight bulkhead system. Water was now cascading directly into the aft compartments of the ship, completely circumventing the heavy steel doors. The Britannic began to develop a severe list to the starboard side. Captain Bartlett, realizing the desperate severity of the situation, makes an incredibly bold and controversial decision. He looks at his charts and sees that the island of Kia is roughly 3 miles away. He orders the engine room to restart the massive engines and desperately attempts to steer the sinking vessel toward the shallows, hoping to run the Britannic aground and beach her before she can slip beneath the waves. It was a valiant, desperate gamble to save his ship and everyone aboard. But this desperate maneuver to beach the ship inadvertently seals the doom of several unfortunate souls. Because the Britannic is now moving forward again, forcing massive amounts of water into the gaping wound at the bow, she is sinking even faster. Furthermore, the ship's severe starboard list is lifting her massive portside propellers entirely out of the water. They are still spinning wildly, thrashing just at the surface of the sea. Bartlett has strictly ordered that no lifeboats are to be launched without his explicit command, precisely because he is trying to maneuver the ship and knows the massive danger of launching boats from a moving vessel. However, in the frantic, terrifying chaos of the evacuation, an officer aft takes it upon himself to begin lowering lifeboats from the port side without the bridge's knowledge. This leads to the most horrific, nightmarish incident of the entire tragedy. 2 lifeboats, fully loaded with terrified crew members, medical staff, and stokers, are lowered into the water on the port side. But because the ship is still moving forward and the massive propellers are spinning half out of the water, these lifeboats are immediately caught in the incredibly powerful suction generated by the giant bronze blades. The helpless occupants in the lifeboats realize with mounting terror what is about to happen. They frantically attempt to row away. They scream in absolute panic, but the suction is simply too strong. The first lifeboat is drawn violently into the spinning blades and is instantly smashed to kindling, killing everyone inside in a horrific spray of splintered wood and churning water. The second lifeboat follows immediately after, pulled inexorably into the deadly vortex. And among the people trapped in that second doomed lifeboat is none other than Violet Jessup. The woman who had survived the Olympic collision and the Titanic sinking is now facing certain death in the churning propellers of the Britannic. In her memoirs, she vividly describes the absolute horror of that moment. Seeing the bodies and the wreckage of the first boat being completely pulverized, she realized her only chance of survival was to abandon the lifeboat immediately. She leaps blindly into the churning, turbulent water just seconds before her boat is entirely annihilated by the massive bronze blades. She is pulled deep underwater by the violent suction. She struggles frantically in the darkness, her lungs burning, the terrible roar of the propellers deafening her. As Violet Jessup fights her way back up toward the surface, her head violently strikes the heavy wooden keel of one of the destroyed lifeboats floating above her. The impact is absolutely brutal, fracturing her skull.
She later credited her incredibly thick, heavy hair, which she had pinned up that morning, with cushioning the blow just enough to save her life. Dazed, bleeding, and barely conscious, she manages to break the surface and is eventually pulled to safety by the occupants of another lifeboat that had managed to steer clear of the deadly stern. It is a miraculous, completely unbelievable escape. Meanwhile, up on the bridge, Captain Bartlett receives the horrific news of the lifeboat massacre. Realizing that moving the ship is only accelerating the flooding and causing unimaginable carnage, he finally orders the engines completely stopped and gives the final command to abandon ship. The evacuation of the Britannic, despite the catastrophic horror at the stern, is remarkably orderly and efficient, standing in stark contrast to the chaotic, disorganized evacuation of the Titanic. The crew is well trained, they have practiced the drills, and the massive gantry davits perform exactly as they were designed to. Even with the ship listing heavily to starboard, the giant cranes are able to smoothly lower the lifeboats into the water. By exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, Captain Bartlett, remaining true to the highest traditions of the sea, blows a final mournful blast on the ship's massive steam whistle. He then casually walks off the rapidly sinking bridge and steps directly into the rising water, swimming away from his doomed vessel. At 9:07 a.m., just 55 minutes after the terrible explosion, the mighty HMHS Britannic rolls over heavily onto her starboard side and quietly slips beneath the surface of the Aegean Sea. The speed at which the Britannic sank is absolutely staggering, especially when you compare it to her sister ship. The Titanic, with all her widely publicized fatal flaws, stayed afloat for 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg. The Britannic, completely redesigned to be vastly superior, fortified with a double skin and massive raised bulkheads, succumbed to the ocean in a mere 55 minutes. It is a chilling testament to the completely overwhelming, uncompromising power of the sea and the absolute unpredictability of catastrophic damage. However, despite the incredibly rapid sinking, the casualty rate on the Britannic tells a vastly different and far less tragic story than the Titanic. That is a crucial distinction to make. Out of the 1,066 people on board the Britannic that morning, an astonishing 1,036 were saved. Only 30 individuals lost their lives, and the vast majority of those terrible casualties occurred during that horrific, unauthorized launching of the lifeboats into the spinning propellers. The low death toll can be attributed to several highly favorable factors. First, the water of the Aegean Sea was relatively warm, roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit, unlike the freezing, completely lethal 28-degree water of the North Atlantic that killed hundreds of Titanic survivors in mere minutes. Second, the disaster happened in broad daylight, in relatively calm weather, close to land. And finally, the rescue response was remarkably swift and effective. Absolutely. The distress signals sent by the Britannic were immediately received by several nearby British vessels. The HMS Scourge, the HMS Heroic, and the HMS Foxhound raced completely flat out to the coordinates in the Kia Channel. By roughly 10 o'clock in the morning, less than an hour after the Britannic had disappeared beneath the waves, these rescue ships were already on the scene, rapidly hauling the traumatized survivors out of the lifeboats and the water. The local Greek fishermen on the island of Kia also rushed out in their small kayaks to assist in the rescue efforts. By the afternoon, the survivors were safely ashore, beginning the long, difficult journey back home. But even as the survivors were being dried off and treated for their injuries, a massive, furious debate was already igniting regarding exactly what had caused the sinking.
For decades, the true cause of the explosion that sank the Britannic remained one of the most fiercely debated mysteries in maritime history. Was it a torpedo fired by a German U-boat, or did she strike a submerged naval mine? The British public, completely fueled by intense wartime propaganda, heavily leaned toward the torpedo theory. The idea that a German submarine had deliberately, maliciously targeted a clearly marked hospital ship carrying wounded soldiers was a narrative that perfectly fit the portrayal of the enemy as utterly ruthless and barbaric. Survivors reported seeing what they believed was the wake of a torpedo speeding toward the ship just moments before the blast. The British government officially supported this deeply controversial theory for quite some time. However, the German government vehemently and completely denied firing a torpedo at the Britannic. Instead, they pointed to the incredibly detailed logs of a specific submarine, the U-73, commanded by a highly decorated officer named Gustav Seyss. According to the completely meticulously kept German naval records, the U-73 had secretly laid a massive string of incredibly powerful contact mines in the Kia Channel just a few weeks prior to the Britannic's arrival. The Germans argued that the massive hospital ship had simply tragically blundered into this invisible underwater minefield. But the complete lack of physical evidence at the time allowed the wild conspiracy theories to flourish.
Some even aggressively suggested that the Britannic had actually been carrying massive, illegal stockpiles of high-explosive munitions secretly hidden deep in her cargo holds, and that a small external explosion had ignited this illicit cargo, causing a catastrophic internal blast that tore the hull apart from the inside out. The absolute truth remained completely hidden in the dark, silent depths of the Aegean Sea for nearly 60 years. It wasn't until 1975 that the legendary French oceanographer and marine explorer Jacques Cousteau embarked on a massive expedition to locate the wreck of the Britannic. Utilizing highly advanced sonar equipment and his completely iconic ship, the Calypso, Cousteau successfully located the massive wreck, resting completely on her starboard side at a depth of roughly 400 feet. Cousteau and his team of elite divers conducted extensive underwater surveys of the massive wreck, bringing back the very first photographic evidence of the doomed Titan. While their initial exploration was deeply fascinating, it didn't completely solve the mystery of the sinking. Subsequent, far more technologically advanced expeditions over the following decades, including deeply detailed surveys by Dr. Robert Ballard, the man famously known for discovering the wreck of the Titanic, finally began to piece together the definitive forensic evidence. By carefully examining the massive, jagged blast damage at the bow, marine forensic experts conclusively determined that the hull plating was completely bent inward, firmly proving that the primary explosion had absolutely originated from an external force, completely disproving the wild illicit munitions conspiracy theory. Furthermore, the massive extent of the damage perfectly matched the devastating destructive power of a standard German contact mine, exactly as Commander Gustav Seyss of the U-73 had originally claimed. The deeply detailed underwater explorations also vividly confirmed the tragic, heartbreaking chain of events that had rapidly doomed the vessel. The highly specialized divers discovered that several of the massive watertight doors in the forward bulkheads were indeed stuck in the open position, completely corroborating the theory that the violent structural distortion from the initial blast had prevented them from closing. And perhaps most chillingly, the dive teams found countless lower deck portholes firmly locked in the open position, definitively proving that the careless, routine airing out of the medical wards had directly and completely fatally compromised the ship's highly advanced watertight integrity, directly leading to her incredibly rapid and shocking demise.
The HMHS Britannic stands as a profoundly tragic, deeply ironic monument to the absolute limits of human engineering and the chaotic, deeply unforgiving nature of war. She was specifically conceived to be the ultimate maritime fortress, completely heavily armored against the ice that had ruthlessly claimed her sister. Yet she was completely undone by an entirely different, highly explosive kind of threat, combined with the incredibly fragile, completely unpredictable nature of human error. The open portholes, the jammed steel doors, the completely unauthorized, catastrophic launching of those doomed lifeboats. It is a profoundly heartbreaking reminder that even the most meticulously designed, highly advanced safety systems can completely unravel in the face of sudden, catastrophic chaos. While the Titanic will forever remain completely etched in our cultural memory as the ultimate symbol of tragic Edwardian hubris, the Britannic thoroughly deserves her own distinct, deeply respected place in history. She wasn't just a doomed sister ship. She was a massive, desperately needed vessel of mercy, heavily dedicated to the noble cause of healing the terrible wounds of a deeply fractured world. She successfully carried thousands of horribly injured soldiers safely home before her own tragic, profoundly violent end. She serves as a deeply poignant, massive reminder of the heavy, terrible toll of conflict and the deeply tragic, profoundly silent elegance of the colossal iron leviathans that once ruled the oceans. Welcome back. We left off at the exact moment the Britannic was rocked by a massive explosion in the Kia Channel on November 21st, 1916. Right, the blast was deafening. Captain Charles Bartlett immediately ordered the watertight doors closed. He believed he could save the ship by beaching it on the nearby island of Kia. It was a desperate gamble. The Britannic was moving forward, but that forward motion was forcing massive amounts of water into the damaged bow at an incredible rate. And this brings up the most controversial question about the sinking. What caused the explosion? Was it a torpedo from a German submarine or an underwater mine? For decades, people debated this. Surviving crew members reported seeing a torpedo wake. However, modern diving expeditions, notably by Jacques Cousteau in 1976, found no evidence of a torpedo strike. Exactly. They discovered the anchor chain of a German mine in the area. It is now widely accepted that the Britannic struck a single mine planted by the German submarine U-73. Yet that one mine caused catastrophic damage. Why did a ship designed to be much safer than the Titanic sink in just 55 minutes? That is the tragic irony. The Britannic had a double-skin hull and raised watertight bulkheads.
but several factors worked against her that morning. First, the portholes. Many nurses had opened the lower deck portholes to air out the wards. When the ship listed, water poured through those open windows. Second, the watertight doors. Some of them failed to close properly because the explosion distorted the lower hull structure. The water easily bypassed the enhanced safety features. And then there is the incredible story of Violet Jessup, a nurse who had survived the Titanic sinking 4 years earlier and was also on board the Olympic during its major collision. Her survival story here is absolutely terrifying. She was in a lifeboat that was sucked into the spinning propeller of the Britannic, which was still turning as the ship sank. She literally had to jump out of her lifeboat at the last possible second to avoid being chopped to pieces. She fractured her skull on the keel but somehow survived. Out of the 1,035 people on board, 30 died. Most of those casualties were from the 2 lifeboats that were drawn into the propellers. It is a remarkable survival rate compared to the Titanic, but still a forgotten tragedy. The lessons learned from the Britannic finally forced maritime engineers to reconsider not just how to build unsinkable ships, but how human error always plays a part. The open portholes and the decision to keep the engines running while lowering boats directly doomed the mighty sister vessel.